You can cut it out, by the way.
Okay, we're going to continue with our Wednesday Wars January reading. And while you're reading along, remember you should be taking notes on a piece of notebook paper, especially if you're following along from home. Get a piece of notebook paper and make sure that you have a notes page titled January. And just to kind of recap what we've read already in January, the chapter began with the students returning after their holiday break, and there were pictures plastered all over the school in every thinkable place of Halling in his yellow tights from the newspaper article that he was featured in. And Doug Switek's brother is the culprit. So he's feeling extremely self-conscious and embarrassed, and that's pretty much where we are in the chapter as the students prepare to take their New York State their New York State exams. All right. So in our books, this will be page 107. I'm thinking of military school, I said again, in Alabama. You don't have to say ridiculous things twice, Halling. Once is more than enough. Why is military school ridiculous? Asked my sister. Today, the Mets decided to pay Buddy Harrelson $18,000 a year to play baseball. Can you imagine that? $18,000 a year just to play baseball? This for a player who can't hit the ball out of the infield. Halling going to military school isn't quite as ridiculous as that, but I'll give him this. It's pretty close. It's not any more ridiculous than going to our high school, said my sister. My father closed his eyes. He took another sip of coffee. I think he was fortifying himself. Girls can't wear their hair too short. Boys can't wear their hair too long, my sister said. We can't wear skirts that are too short, or slacks that are too long, or sweaters that are too tight, or jeans that are too, and I'm not making this up, too blue. We can't even wear a turtleneck because it's too something. No one knows what, but it's something. Now, that's ridiculous. That a principal even cares about this stuff while bombs are dropping on people who hardly have any clothes is even more ridiculous. You don't wear those things because you're not a hippie, said my father. His eyes were still closed. What's all that got to do with education? Why can a principal just make up all those rules? My father opened his eyes. Because he can, he said, and put down his cup of coffee. $18,000. They are out of their minds. The Alabama Military Institute faded right away. After supper, my sister came into my room. So, you don't think you need to knock? I said. Halling, going to military school is a ridiculous idea. That's not what you said at supper. It's not a ridiculous idea because of why Dad thinks it's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous idea because it's military school, and because the next stop after military school is Saigon. So, she put her hands on her hips. Sometimes I wonder if you're even worth trying to save, she said. There's a war going on in Vietnam, Halling. Have you noticed? A war. 200 soldiers die every week. They come back home in black body bags, stacked into planes. And after they're buried in the ground, their families get a new American flag with fancy folds, and that's it. She stopped, and I couldn't stand it if... She stopped again. It's a ridiculous idea, Halling, she said, and left. Pete Seeger began to play loudly in her room. In your notes, you should probably add something about his sister showing this level of concern. This is one of the more serious conversations that he has had with his sister, and that's character development and relationship development. The next afternoon, after everyone had left for Temple Beth El or St. Adalbert's, and after Doug Switek and Danny had waited around until the last minute in case Mrs. Baker had arranged for Whitey Ford to show up, Mrs. Baker handed me back my Macbeth test. Macbeth and Malcolm are not the same person, though their names share an initial consonant, she said. I know, I said. Nor are Duncan and Donalbain, who also share an initial and, for that matter, concluding consonant, the same person. I guess not, I said. Malcolm and Donalbain are the king's sons, not. You know, I said, it's not so easy to read Shakespeare, especially when he can't come up with names that you can tell apart. Mrs. Baker rolled her eyes. This time I was sure. Shakespeare did not write for your ease of reading, she said. No kidding, I thought. He wrote to express something about what it means to be a human being in words more beautiful than had ever been written. So in Macbeth, when he wasn't trying to find names that sound alike. What did he want to express in words more beautiful than had ever yet been written? Mrs. Baker looked at me for a long moment. Then she went and sat back down at her desk. That we are made for more than power, she said softly. That we are made for more than our desires. That pride combined with stubbornness can be disaster. And that compared with love, malice is a small and petty thing. We were both quiet. Malice is not always small and petty, I said. Have you seen what Doug Switek's brother put up in the halls? I have, said Mrs. Baker. A wonderful picture of you playing a wonderful part. In yellow tights, I said. Well, she said, you may chance have some odd quirks and remnants of wit broken on you. That doesn't sound like it's from Macbeth. It's not, but I promise you, people will soon forget about Ariel. I sighed. It's a whole lot easier saying that than seeing yourself in that picture. I suppose that would be true, she said. It's not like it's your picture in the halls, or that you have all that much to worry about, I said. I know. Dumb. Mrs. Baker's face went suddenly white. She opened her lower desk drawer, put her copy of Shakespeare into it, and closed it. Loudly. Go sit down and fix the errors on your Macbeth exam, she said. I did. We said nothing else to each other that whole afternoon, not even when I left. I walked home under gray clouds whose undersides had been shredded. They hung in tatters, and a cold mist leaked out of them. The cold got colder, and the mist got mistier all through the afternoon, so that by supper time a drizzle was making everything wet and everyone miserable, especially my sister, who believed that she had hair that belonged in Southern California, where it would be springy and bouncy all the time, instead of in gray, cold, misty Long Island, where it just hung. So dumb. Lying in bed that night, I listened as the drizzle turned to rain, and then the rain started to spatter thickly on the window, and then all sounds of it faded away, and my room began to grow cold. I got up and looked out, but the glass was covered with a sheet of thin ice, and the only thing I could see was the crazed pattern of the streetlight outside. In the morning, ice covered the town. If the sun had been shining, it would have been a spectacle like something Prospero might conjure up. But as it was, the tattered gray clouds hung even lower, and the mist was leaking out of them again, and the town looked more like the kind of foul heath where Macbeth's 3 weird sisters lived. As I walked to school that morning, the mist laid down a fine, light coating of water on last night's ice, and by the time I got to the library, I could stand on the sidewalk, give a little push, and slide. By the time I got to Goldman's Best Bakery, I didn't even need to push. The last block and a half was all downhill, so I pointed my feet, leaned down a bit, bent my knees, and let myself go. Since there wasn't a single car anywhere, I didn't even stop at the corners. By the time I reached Camillo Junior High, I had enough speed to take out Doug Switek's brother if he'd been anywhere in sight. And then, suddenly, there he was, just like the 3 weird sisters appearing because Macbeth had thought of them. Doug Switek's brother, on the other side of Camillo Junior High, waiting for a school bus to turn the corner so that he could grab onto its bumper and have it pull him along on the icy roads. It was what 8th graders whose career goal was the state penitentiary did. The school buses were driving around town, even though no cars were because Mr. Goreshi was principal of Camillo Junior High, and Mr. Goreshi wouldn't have let the school close right before the New York State Standardized Achievement Test, even if the Soviet Union had started raining atomic bombs on the entire east coast of the United States. I heard that from Mr. Petrelli himself, and it's probably true. So the buses were driving on ice, and they all pulled in late, and you only had to look at the drivers' faces to see they were all mad at Mr. Goreshi. And Mrs. Baker was mad because we straggled in throughout the morning because the buses were late. I figured that the only one who was happy in the whole school was Mr. Ledema, Doug Switek's brother's teacher, because Doug Switek's brother stayed out until the last bus came in. It's the dictator of a small country thing, Danny said when he finally got to class. He was on the last bus. Mr. Goreshi thinks he can control the weather. He tells us to come to school in the ice, and we come. He tells the bus drivers to drive in the ice, and they drive. He controls all the school buses of the world. He held his hands up high in the air. He controls us all. Danny Heffer can get carried away. But even if Mr. Goreshi could control the school buses, like the dictator of a small country, he couldn't control the Long Island Power Company, which that morning was spending its time not giving electricity to most of its customers, including Camillo Junior High. You couldn't have raised a spark of electricity anywhere. Any light that came into the classrooms was from the windows on a day of gray, tattered clouds that wasn't much. So we sat in the half-dark, in our coats, in the cold. We could hear Sycorax and Caliban scurrying in the walls, climbing down from the ceiling to find someplace warm to burrow in, like a human body. I figured they probably could sense us, and soon the walls would start to shred, and we'd see claws and nails, and there would be clacking yellow teeth, and before Birnam Wood could come to Dunsinane, we'd all run screaming out of the room into the misty cold. That's how we spent our day, preparing for the New York State Standardized Achievement Test. In Miss Baker's class, we drilled on sentence diagramming. In Mr. Samowitz's class, we drilled on mathematical sets. We didn't tell his homeroom class, who were coming into our room for sentence diagramming, about Sycorax and Caliban. We figured we'd hear if anything happened. In Miss Petrelli's class, we recited European borders and exports. And as we drilled, our hands got colder and colder, so that by noon it was hard to feel our pencils with our fingers. But at lunch, Miss Biggio came into the classroom carrying a tray of thick paper cups, steaming with the hot scent of chocolate, probably because she felt guilty about the something surprise from before the holidays. "Don't ask how I got 'em hot," she said to Mrs. Baker, "but if Mr. Goreshi's looking for his desk, he might have a hard time finding it." Can you believe it? Hot chocolate! Mrs. Baker laughed, a real laugh, not a teacher laugh, and sat down behind her desk with the cup that Miss Biggio gave her. She held both her hands around it to warm them. Miss Biggio walked down the aisles, and we each took a cup from her tray. Doug Switek tried to take two, but when Miss Biggio put her heavy and sensible shoe on his sneaker, he put the extra cup back. My tea did not reach for the chocolate when Miss Biggio came beside her. She did not raise her head, and Miss Biggio did not pause. She finished the rest of the aisles and left with one cup still steaming on her tray. "Let's begin the next sentences," said Mrs. Baker. We groaned. "Now," said Mrs. Baker, "while the sugar is coursing through your veins." She walked up and down the aisles to watch us work. I don't know if anyone else saw her put her cup of hot chocolate on my tea's desk. And that's the end of our reading for Monday. You want to add to your notes some of the things that have added to our plot and characterization and mood in these pages. So this was pages 107 to 113. Make a mention of what you think about the principal making them all come to school in the weather that they're having, and what you think about them working in school with no electricity and how cold it is. And think about Miss Biggio and her interaction with my tea again when she's passing out the hot chocolate.